There was a stranger, maybe on a crowded street, maybe in a waiting room, maybe just a face you scrolled past that stopped you for a half-second longer than it should have. They didn't say anything that mattered. They didn't know you. And yet, something in you recognized something, the way a tuning fork doesn't make a sound until another one rings near it. You felt it in the back of your throat before you named it, and what came up wasn't about them at all. It was about a door you have been standing in front of for longer than you want to admit. Not quite entering, not quite leaving, just standing there, hand not yet on the handle, telling yourself you needed more time. You don't have more time. Not because something is ending, but because something is already beginning, and it began without asking your permission. Right now, in this window, one of the most significant oppositions in the sky is exact, and it is not subtle, and it is not metaphorical, and it is not going to wait for you to feel ready. 3 signs in particular are standing directly on the fault line of this transit, standing exactly where the old ground breaks and the new ground starts. Not every sign, not even most of them. 3. And if you are one of them, you already feel it. Something became impossible to keep pretending about sometime in the last several days, and you cannot locate the moment it happened, only that it did. Before we go any further, like this video and subscribe and comment below. I'm ready. It's a small signal that you're here and open to what's arriving. This is the opposition of Jupiter and Pluto, 2 planets that do not compromise. 2 planets that, when they lock into a direct confrontation across the sky, force an accounting that has been building for years, sometimes for nearly a decade, and which no amount of avoidance, patience, or grace period requesting will postpone any further. To understand what this means in your life right now, you need to understand what each of these forces actually is, not in the abstract language of astrology, but in the felt language of a human life. Jupiter is expansion, but not the shallow kind. Jupiter is not about getting more. Jupiter is the force that decides what you are allowed to become. It is the breath that the universe takes on your behalf when you have been held too small for too long. It governs meaning, the deep structural kind, the kind that tells you why you are doing what you are doing, whether the story you are living is actually yours, whether the life you have built reflects the person you have become or only the person you used to be. When Jupiter is active in your chart, doors open. Not always the doors you expected, often not the ones you planned for, but the ones that were always meant to open if you had ever gotten brave enough to walk toward them. Jupiter does not force you through. It only shows you that the wall was a door all along. Pluto is something else entirely. Pluto is the force beneath the force. It is what operates in the deep architecture of your life, the unconscious agreements you made years ago about what you deserve, what is possible for you, what kind of love is realistic, what kind of power is appropriate to ask for. Pluto rules transformation, not the pleasant kind, not the kind that arrives like a gift, the kind that arrives like a demolition that you eventually realize was a renovation. Pluto does not remove things from your life without reason. It removes the things that were preventing you from becoming who you are meant to be. And right now, Pluto is retrograde, which means it is doing its work from the inside. Not tearing things down from outside, reaching into the interior of your life and quietly rerouting the wiring. When Jupiter and Pluto oppose each other across the sky, what happens is this: expansion meets power. The force that wants to open you up runs directly into the force that has been holding a locked structure in place. And that collision, that tension across the sky, is not a crisis. It is a completion. This is not 2 bad things happening at once. This is the moment when the truth of what you have outgrown cannot be hidden by the comfort of what is familiar. The door you have been standing in front of. Jupiter is the hand on your back saying go forward. Pluto is the key that already turned in the lock, whether you know it or not. This is why this window is not an ordinary one. Most days the planets operate in the background, influencing mood, tilting energy, shifting the odds of certain outcomes. This is not that. This is a structural event. This is the kind of transit that you look back on in 2 years and say, that was when everything changed. Not because something dramatic necessarily happened on the outside, though it might. Because something became permanently true on the inside. And once something becomes permanently true on the inside, the outside cannot stay the same for long. Now here is what you need to understand. Not everyone feels this transit equally. Not every sign is standing on the fault line right now. This transit operates most powerfully along specific axes, in specific houses, for specific signs, and the signs it is reaching are not the ones in comfortable territory. The signs this transit is activating right now are not being offered something easy. They are being offered something real. There is a difference. Easy dissolves. Real endures. And the people this transit is calling are not being called because they are ready. They are being called because they have already done the preparation, whether they named it that or not, and the door they have been standing in front of is, right now, in this window, no longer locked. You might be feeling it as restlessness that has no clean object. You can't point to the specific thing, only the sensation that something is unfinished and cannot stay unfinished. You might be feeling it as a sudden clarity about something you have been soft-pedaling for months, a relationship, a role, a version of yourself that doesn't fit anymore. You might be feeling it as grief, because some of what is moving through this transit is the grief of finally acknowledging that something was never going to be what you needed it to be, and it is time to stop asking it to become that. Whatever texture it is arriving in for you, this is not noise. This is signal. Which three signs are standing in this transit's direct path? These are Leo, Aquarius, and Sagittarius. The reasoning is not arbitrary, and it is not symbolic. It is structural. Jupiter sits in Leo right now, making Leo the sign most physically occupied by the expanding force. Pluto sits in Aquarius, making Aquarius the sign most physically occupied by the transforming, restructuring force. And, in its retrograde motion, Pluto is doing the deepest possible internal work for Aquarius. These two signs form the literal axis of this opposition. Leo and Aquarius face each other across the sky, and what happens on this axis lands in both simultaneously. They are not separate stories. They are two sides of the same reckoning. Sagittarius enters the picture because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, meaning when Jupiter is activated, Sagittarius receives the signal directly. Whatever Jupiter is doing in the sky, Sagittarius feels it as if it were happening in its own living room. These three signs, not because they are special in a flattering sense, because right now, the sky is moving through them. The first sign is Leo. For Leo, Jupiter, the planet of expansion, meaning, and becoming, is physically sitting in your sign right now. This is not a background influence. This is Jupiter in your own territory, pressing its hand against everything that has been limiting you and asking a question that has become impossible to ignore. How much bigger is the person you are now than the version of yourself you have been willing to show? But Jupiter in your sign is not the whole story. Because across the sky from you, Pluto sits in Aquarius, your seventh house, the house of partnership, one-on-one relationships, the people who face you directly, the contracts both written and unwritten. Your seventh house is the house of what you meet when you look up from yourself. It is the mirror that another person holds. It is the space where your identity is tested against contact with another. This means the opposition of Jupiter and Pluto is landing for you specifically in the axis between your sense of self and your relationships. And what is being activated, what is being forced into the light, is the question of whether the relationships you are in, or the kind of relationship you have been available for, actually match the size of who you have become. This is not a gentle realization. Pluto in your seventh house, retrograde, has been doing quiet demolition work on the structures of your partnerships, on the unconscious agreements you made about what you deserve from another person, about how much of yourself you are permitted to bring into a relationship, about whether the person across from you actually sees you, or only a version of you that they found comfortable. And Jupiter in your first house territory, your own sign, is expanding your sense of what is possible, what is rightfully yours, so fast that the gap between what you have been accepting and what you now know you require has become impossible to straddle. The concrete shape this takes in your life right now is the arrival of clarity about a specific relationship, whether that is a romantic partner, a business partner, a close friend, a person whose opinion has structured your choices. Something about that dynamic has become visible that was not visible before. Not because anything dramatic happened necessarily, but because you are no longer able to unsee it. A pattern that you had soft-pedaled, explained away, allowed because the alternative felt too destabilizing. That pattern is now presenting itself as a choice, not a crisis, a choice. Stay in the version of this relationship that asks you to stay small, or ask for the version that matches who you actually are. Both are available, but only one of them is available for long. The tension this transit carries for Leo is this: Jupiter wants to expand you outward, more visibility, more authority, more embodied presence in the world. But Pluto in your 7th is asking what will happen to your most important relationships when you expand. Some relationships were calibrated to a smaller version of you. They were built around a dynamic that worked when you were less sure of yourself. They may not automatically recalibrate when you grow. And the cost of this transit, the real one, is the possibility that becoming more fully yourself will require renegotiating something or releasing something that felt safe precisely because it was familiar. This is not destruction. This is the old door finally admitting it cannot hold. Leo, you are not losing what was real. You are outgrowing what was only ever a container. The second sign this lands on is Aquarius. For Aquarius, the placement could not be more direct or more personal. Pluto is sitting in your sign, in your 1st house, the house of identity, of the self, of the face you present, and the person you are in the process of becoming. And it is retrograde. Pluto retrograde in your 1st house is not a passive experience. It is excavation. It is the systematic dismantling of the self-concept that was built not from the inside out, but from the outside in. The identity you constructed in response to other people's expectations, other people's needs, other people's definitions of who you were supposed to be. Pluto does not remove the self. It removes the false version of the self that was keeping the real one in the dark. And now Jupiter, sitting in Leo, your 7th house, the house of partnerships and the people who stand directly across from you, is opposing that process from outside. Jupiter in your 7th house is expanding the possibilities available in your relationships. It is opening doors in the direction of partnerships that are more expansive, more honest, more reciprocally nourishing than what you have been settling for. But here is the thing about Jupiter in your 7th house opposing Pluto in your 1st. The expansion being offered to you in the external world of relationships cannot be fully received by the version of you that has been managing, shrinking, or performing. The new partnerships, or the new level of an existing partnership, require the real you. And Pluto has been busy, quietly and relentlessly, getting the real you ready to arrive. The concrete shape this takes for Aquarius right now is a shift in how you present yourself in one-on-one interactions. Something in the way you have been navigating your most important relationship, or the way you have been available to relationships generally, is changing at a structural level. You may find yourself less willing to soften your perspective to keep the peace, less willing to play a role that was always more about comfort than truth. You may find that something you said or didn't say recently landed differently than it would have 6 months ago, not because you tried harder, but because the person doing the saying has quietly become less negotiable about their own reality. The tension this transit holds for Aquarius is the friction between the new self that is emerging and the relationships that were calibrated to the old one. Pluto in your 1st house is changing who you are at depth. Jupiter in your 7th is illuminating what is possible in relationship. The gap between those two things, between who you are becoming and what the people in your life have been responding to, that gap is now visible. Not everyone in your relational world will meet the person you are becoming with equal ease. Some will. Some will find it a relief. They wanted the real you all along. Others will find it destabilizing. This is not your fault, and it is not theirs. It is the mathematics of transformation meeting the geometry of relationship. Aquarius, what is being reclaimed right now is not something you lost. It is something that was always underneath, and it has been waiting this entire time for the excavation to reach it. And the 3rd, Sagittarius. For Sagittarius, the activation arrives through Jupiter, which is the planet that rules you, your ruling body, the force that is most directly attuned to your nature and your needs. When Jupiter moves, you feel it as a kind of inner orientation, a shift in the compass that tells you which direction is forward. And right now, Jupiter is in Leo, which, for Sagittarius, is your 3rd house, the house of communication, of the immediate environment, of the words you say and the stories you tell, of the conversations that have been circling without landing, of the messages sent and not replied to, the conversations left unfinished, the thing you have been wanting to say for longer than you can quite account for. Jupiter in your third house is expanding your capacity for honest communication. It is making the space between what you feel and what you are willing to say feel shorter. Not because you have become reckless, but because the cost of not saying it has become higher than the risk of saying it. At the same time, Pluto's retrograde in Aquarius is in your third house's partner, the ninth house, the house of belief, meaning, higher understanding, the world view that structures how you interpret everything else. Pluto has been, for some time now, slowly dismantling the belief systems that were no longer true for you. The philosophies you inherited, the stories you were told about what your life was supposed to look like, the meaning frameworks that once gave you comfort but have quietly become cages. The concrete shape this takes for Sagittarius in this window is a conversation that needs to happen, or a piece of writing that needs to emerge, or a truth that needs to find its voice. And the timing is now because the new belief system that Pluto has been building has finally reached a point of structural integrity. You are not speaking from a place of reaction. You are speaking from a place of knowing. There is a difference, and you can feel it. What you say right now carries a different kind of weight, not because you are trying to convince anyone, but because you are no longer trying to convince yourself. The tension for Sagittarius is the tension between the freedom of finally saying the true thing and the responsibility that comes with that. Communication has consequences. Words rearrange relationships. And some of the conversations available to you in this window are not small ones. They are the conversations that change the shape of a relationship permanently, not because they are hostile, but because they are honest in a way that previous versions of the conversation were not. There is no unkindness here. There is only clarity. And clarity, after a long period of managed vagueness, can feel like a storm to people who got comfortable with the fog. Sagittarius, what is being returned to you right now is your voice, not the one you modulated for other people's comfort, but the one that has always known what it needed to say. Now, zoom back out, because what is happening beneath all three of these activations, and beneath the experience of everyone who is feeling this transit in some form today, is something that does not belong to astrology alone. It belongs to the deep mechanism of how a life changes, and understanding that mechanism is what makes the difference between experiencing this window as disruption and experiencing it as the threshold it actually is. What Jupiter opposite Pluto is really doing is forcing a confrontation between two things that have been allowed to coexist in your life for too long. The version of yourself that adapted to what was available, and the version of yourself that knows what is actually true. You have been managing both. You have been running both systems simultaneously, the outer presentation calibrated to the environment you found yourself in, and the inner knowing that has been quietly, persistently insisting on something different. And for a long time, the management was possible. For a long time, the gap between who you were being and who you actually are was narrow enough that you could maintain it without too much cost. But planets that move as slowly as Jupiter and Pluto do not permit indefinite management. Jupiter has been building toward this opposition for months, expanding your capacity for self-knowledge, your tolerance for your own truth, your sense of what you are entitled to ask for in this life. And Pluto, retrograde and interior, has been doing what it always does when it goes underground. It has been removing the unconscious structures that made the old version of you feel necessary. The adaptations, the shrinking, the careful calibration of how much of yourself to show, in which rooms, to which people, at what volume. Pluto retrograde has been quietly making those structures unavailable, not because someone decided you needed transformation, because the structures themselves were no longer load-bearing. And now they meet in full opposition. And the result of that meeting is not a crisis, it is a revelation. The revelation that the distance between who you have been presenting and who you actually are is no longer bridgeable by the usual strategies. The revelation that the door you have been standing in front of was never locked from the outside. The revelation that the most significant thing preventing your expansion was a belief about your own limits that was formed in a very different context, by a very different version of you under circumstances that no longer apply. This is not a comfortable revelation. Let's be honest about that. Comfortable revelations do not require planets like Pluto. What is coming up for you in this window may carry grief. Real grief, not the soft kind, but the kind that has been waiting under the surface of a long patience. The grief of finally acknowledging that something you hoped would change did not change. The grief of a door that stayed closed for so long that you organized your whole life around the closed door version of things. The grief of recognizing that some of the delays you experienced were, in fact, preparations, and that what you were being prepared for is arriving now, and that the relief of its arrival is inseparable from the ache of everything it cost you to get here. Give that grief its space. This is not the moment to rush past it in the direction of the new thing. The new thing will be there. Jupiter does not retract. Pluto does not renovate halfway. The threshold is real and it is open. But if you move toward the new without honoring what the old cost, you carry the unprocessed cost into the new space. And then you wonder why the new space does not feel as clean as it should. The threshold asks you to pause briefly at the line, to feel the weight of what you are carrying and to set down what no longer belongs in the life on the other side. This is why the stranger mattered. That face you couldn't stop at, that brief wordless recognition. It wasn't about them. It was about the part of you that recognized something in the encounter that your ordinary life had not been offering. The feeling of being met at your actual size. The feeling of a moment that didn't ask you to manage your edges. Your system registered it before your mind did, because your system has been in a state of heightened sensitivity to exactly this kind of signal. You are not imagining things. You are finally tuned to the right frequency. Your body already knows that this is not a normal window. The knowledge arrived before the understanding did. You have been feeling it in very specific physical registers, not in your chest, not in the dramatic places where emotion gets performed for an audience, but in the quieter, more structural parts of the body where true recalibration lives. The jaw releases. In the middle of a sentence, in the middle of something entirely ordinary, the jaw simply lets go. Not because you decided to relax, but because the tension that was holding it was holding something that is no longer necessary to hold. The hands rest differently when they are not in use. Not limp, not anxious, just resting, as if they have set something down and have not yet picked it up again, and the interval between the two feels unusually spacious. The throat clears for no reason, once, then not again, as if something that was occupying a small passage has moved through and out. The back of the neck shifts in quality. There is a quality of tension at the back of the neck that comes from managing information you haven't fully acknowledged, a kind of low-grade vigilance that your nervous system runs in the background when you are living in the gap between what you know and what you are admitting. And in this window, that quality changes. It doesn't vanish, but the texture of it changes. The way a held breath changes when it begins to release, not all at once, but with a kind of slow, structural inevitability. The sleep is different, either deeper than usual or strange in its imagery, or interrupted at a specific hour by something that is not quite anxiety and not quite wakefulness, but is something in between, a kind of processing that the body does when it is catching up to where the soul has already arrived. Both versions are normal. Both versions are the body doing its work. The eyes rest differently on familiar things. A room you have been in 100 times looks briefly foreign, not alarming, just noticeably different, as if you are looking at it from a slightly altered angle that is technically the same angle but is not quite the same perspective. This is not dissociation. This is the body's way of registering that you are moving from one state of being to another, and that the familiar environment has not yet been updated to match the person who is inhabiting it. Your body is not confused. It is recalibrating, and this is what recalibration feels like. It feels like a slight unfamiliarity with things that were entirely familiar, because the self that made them familiar is no longer entirely the same self that is encountering them now. And alongside the physical signals of release, there are the signals of a new standard taking hold. This is perhaps the most disorienting part of this window, not the grand revelations, but the small, quiet, entirely undramatic moments in which you realize that something you used to be able to accept is no longer acceptable to your system, not as a decision, not as a principle you are upholding, simply as a fact about what your nervous system will now process and what it will not. You will find yourself less able to be in communication that is not honest, not hostile, not demanding, just less able to maintain the motions of exchange when the exchange is hollow. The tolerance for interactions that orbit real contact without landing in it has narrowed. You may not even be able to explain why a conversation leaves you depleted in a new way, only that it does, and that the depletion feels different from exhaustion, closer to a kind of quiet refusal that is happening at a level below your decisions. For those for whom this transit has romantic resonance, what stops being tolerable is the performance of closeness, the gesture that substitutes for presence, the text that arrives after too long a silence that attempts to compress the silence into something manageable. What your system is no longer able to receive as sufficient is contact that asks you to do the interpretive work, to decide for yourself whether this person is actually here, actually seeing you, actually offering something real. This is not a new demand. You have always needed real contact. What is new is the inability to process the insufficient version as if it were real. For those for whom this transit is showing up in terms of work, purpose, or public life, what stops being tolerable is the underuse of your actual capacity, the role that was designed for a version of you that existed several years ago and has not been updated, the space that asks you to make yourself legible to people who are not looking carefully, the contributions that are received without acknowledgement of their real weight. None of this was ever truly acceptable, but it was manageable. And in this window, the management is no longer available. This is not you becoming difficult. This is the new standard. There is a lock on a door somewhere in your life, a specific lock, a specific door, and the key that you have been using to open it no longer fits. Not because the lock changed, because the key changed. You are holding a different key now. Not a master key, not an all-problem-solved key, but a key that is calibrated to the actual door that was meant for you, which is not the same door you have been entering and exiting in the architecture of the old life. The key that no longer fits is not a failure. It is proof that something has genuinely shifted, and here is where you are standing right now. Not metaphorically, actually. You are standing between two timelines, and both of them are visible, and you can feel the pull of each. The first timeline is the one that continues from where you are. It does not require any acknowledgement that anything fundamental has changed. It asks you to absorb what you have realized in this window and file it under something to think about later, to take the new key and put it in your pocket without using it yet, to return to the familiar architecture of the current life and wait for some external permission, some sign, some signal, some moment that is more obviously the moment, before you walk through the door that has already opened. This timeline is not a failure. It is familiar, and familiarity has its own kind of comfort, and comfort has its own kind of legitimacy, and anyone who tells you that choosing continuity is simply fear is not accounting for the real weight of what continuity costs to maintain. You would not be here, watching this, if you did not have some relationship to the courage that staying requires. The second timeline is the one that begins from the recognition, the one that begins from the moment you stop treating the internal knowing as something that requires further confirmation before it is allowed to influence your actions. In this timeline, you do not wait for the external world to offer you a version of yourself that matches who you have become. You bring who you have become to the external world, specifically to the one interaction, the one relationship, the one decision, the one conversation or silence or boundary or opening that this transit has illuminated for you in this window. You do not need to do everything at once. You do not need to demolish the old architecture today. You need to take one action that is native to the person you are now, one action that the previous version of you would have deferred, softened, waited on. Both timelines are available. Not equally, not for much longer. Thresholds have a quality of duration, and this one is open now, in this window, more completely than it will be once the planets move on. But both are available, and both will teach you something, and both will bring you, eventually, to the same place, because Pluto does not abandon its work, and Jupiter does not retract its expansion. The question is only whether you move through this threshold consciously, or get carried through it by the accumulation of what you can no longer sustain. And you are here, paying attention, which means you are already in the conscious version. The question is only how far you are willing to let that consciousness lead. What do you want to remember of this moment 1 year from now? Not what you wished you had done, not what you waited for. What did you actually allow yourself to become in the window when the door was fully open and the key was in your hand and the only thing required was the willingness to use it? That question is not rhetorical. Let it settle somewhere below the sternum. That is where the real answer lives, not in the answer you would give out loud, but in the one your body already carries. Like this video, if you feel this window landing somewhere real in you, not as a gesture toward the algorithm, but as a signal to yourself that you are taking this seriously, that you are in the part of your life where you pay attention to what the sky is actually saying. Subscribe, because these windows build on each other. What begins here will have a counterpart in the next transit, and the one after that, and following the thread across these windows is how the bigger picture becomes visible. And comment below the phrase, "The door is open," not to announce it to anyone, to hear yourself say it. And if someone in your life is at their own threshold right now, if someone you know is standing in front of a door they cannot quite find the courage to walk toward, share this with them. Sometimes the only thing missing is the language for what is already felt. This transit is not asking you to be brave in the dramatic sense. It is not asking you to blow anything up or make declarations or walk away from everything that was. It is asking you for something smaller and harder than any of those things. It is asking you to recognize yourself, to see in the life you are currently living the gap between who you have been performing and who you actually are, and to take one step, one clear-eyed, deliberate step in the direction of the latter. That is all a threshold requires. One step over the line. The rest follows from there, as it always has, as it always does, for the people who were paying attention when the window opened. What was before this moment is already behind you. Not because it doesn't matter, it does, it always will, but because you have seen something in this window that cannot be unseen, and the self that has seen it is the self that now moves forward. You do not need to be different tomorrow than you were yesterday. You only need to be honest about what you now know. That knowledge is the new beginning. It is already yours. It has been yours for longer than today. Today is simply the day you stopped pretending it wasn't. And the knowing does not ask you to be ready. It only asks you to be honest. There is a difference between readiness and honesty that this transit makes unmistakably clear. Readiness is a condition you wait to arrive in, a state you prepare for, a threshold you approach only once you have assembled enough evidence that crossing it is safe. Honesty is simply the act of seeing what is already true and refusing to look away. You do not need to be ready for what this window is offering. You need to be honest about the fact that it is being offered, that the expansion is real, that the excavation has done its work, that the key in your hand fits a door that has been waiting, and that waiting any longer is no longer an act of wisdom but of habit. Habit dressed as patience, delay dressed as discernment. The transit sees the difference, even when you cannot. And now, so do you.